William Pitt was highly respected during his tenure as Prime Minister of England. On one occasion, someone asked William Pitt, "What are the qualifications for a person to be Prime Minister?" You know what his answer was? Well, patience, patience, and then patience. Solomon in Proverbs 16:32 put it this way. He said, "A person who can control his spirit is better than the mighty." And if you can control your spirit, he says, you have more power at your disposal than a person who captures a city. That's how important controlling the spirit and being patient is. Paul said in Galatians 5, it's one of the ways we know that God's Spirit is working in us, and that is if we're patient. How do we know? Well, Jesus said you'll know them by their fruits, and Paul said one fruit of the Spirit is patience, love, joy, peace, patience. One way you know God's molding, shaping that heart, and you're being the kind of person God wants you to be. And then in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul talks a lot about love and how important it is. In fact, it's greater than all other things, love for him and our neighbor. And then Paul gives 16 verbs. He doesn't define love. He just shows what it looks like. 16 characteristics of it. This is what it looks like on a daily basis, he says. And guess what the first characteristic is of love? Love is patient. Love is patient. Patience is an attribute that man should have begins from the very beginning. We see it in Genesis. Abraham and Sarah had to be patient, waiting for that son, according to the promise of God. He was a century old and she was 90. Job, of course, very patient. And as John finishes the letters to the churches, he talks a lot about patience, perseverance, and endurance in the midst of great trials. So we see it running from beginning to end in the Bible. I want us to especially focus this morning on patience as it's taught by God's servant, James. Look with me at James 5, please. James chapter 5. James has a lot to say about patience. As we studied this letter with Adam a few months ago, we were able to see that. James chapter 5, here we use the word patience several times. Verse 7, let's start there, please. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Behold, the farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and the late rains. You too, be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Verse 9, don't complain, brethren, against one another, that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. Verse 10, as an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we count those blessed who endured. You've heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. No question, patience is a very important subject here in the letter of James. In fact, if you recall, James begins this letter talking about patience. Look back at chapter 1 of James. There in verse 2, he'll say, count it all joy, brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And what is endurance doing? While we're enduring and being patient, James says, God's working in your heart. Let endurance have its perfect result. So while you're surrendering in patience to the Lord and enduring these circumstances, God is molding and shaping that heart, and it is having its perfect result that you may be patient, complete, and lacking in nothing. And then in chapter 1 and verse 12, he'll say, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. He will receive the crown of life. So he begins the letter talking about the need for patience, and then he ends the letter talking about the need for patience. In verse 7 through 11, 4 times he'll use patience as a verb. He's not just saying understand patience, he says be patient. And then 2 times in verse 11, he uses a little different Greek word, but the same basic meaning, and it's translated usually perseverance or endurance. So 6 times basically in just a few verses. Patience literally means to abide under. Whatever the trial, whatever the source, you're abiding under. You're enduring. You're persevering. Patience is passive, but it's also active. And in the passive sense, in verse 7, we're back in chapter 5 now. In the passive sense, James says we're to be like the farmer. And what does he do? Well, he waits for the early rains, and he waits for the late rains, and of course, then he must wait for the harvest. In like manner, James says, wait upon the Lord to answer our prayers in his time and in his way. Wait upon the Lord for strength that he will provide. And then, of course, we wait upon the Lord just as Leda did to take us home. Such a faith as that abides under pressure is allowing God to work in our heart and producing a spiritual harvest in the heart. You know, the farmer has planted that seed in the ground. And while he's waiting for the early rain, the late rain, and of course, cultivating whatever he needs to do, marvelous things are happening in that soil. You know that's true. It's amazing what's going on in that soil. He's waiting, but great produce is being brought about in that soil. The point is this: God is like a spiritual farmer, brethren. And he plants his seed, his word in your heart. And as you surrender to him and you wait upon the Lord in answering your prayers, his time, his way, his strength, then wonderful things are happening in your heart. You're allowing that to happen. And God is yielding within your heart as he works within your heart. Just marvelous things, really. But patience is also active. In being patient, we're moving forward. We're making progress. We're not just hunkering down in the midst of this storm and riding it out. We're actually moving, taking steps in spite of this terrible wind that's blowing. We're maturing. We're growing. To these same Christians, chapter 1, look at James chapter 1, verse 22, please. James said, prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers deluding themselves. Now keep in mind, James said this to Christians facing extreme hardship. These Christians were having difficulty finding work. They're already just a day or two ahead of hunger, and unbelieving Jews are not giving them work. And even if you have money, they may not sell you food or other things that you need. And even if you have work, James says in chapter 5 that some of these unbelieving Jews wouldn't pay you. You've worked all season and they won't pay you. And a corrupt court system is backing them up. These are the kind of trials these people are facing. And yet James says, be doers of the word, and not merely hearers, deluding themselves. In chapter 1, verse 27, he said, this is pure and undefiled religion, the sight of God our Father. Visit, get out there, visit orphans and widows, assess the needs that they have physically, mentally, socially, spiritually. Assess the needs, and this is how we keep ourselves unspotted in part from the world. Visit. Chapter 2, verse 2. If a man comes into your assembly, even though there's persecution going on, the same persecution you read of in Acts 8, well, that hasn't stopped. It's only escalated, and they're still assembling. Though they're in danger and the danger is growing, they're still assembling. By the time you get to Hebrews, which was written somewhere in the 60s, as Eddie's pointed out recently, they're still told to assemble, not forsake that assembly, as some are doing. You assemble together, even though they're in great danger by doing so from unbelievers. And then in chapter 2, verse 14, he says, what use is it, brethren, if a man says he has faith, he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and need of daily food, and one says, go in peace, be warmed, be filled, and yet you don't give them what's necessary, what use is that? Even so, faith without works is dead. So he challenges them to back up their profession with good works. This have a nice day Christianity just won't cut it with God. We need to be busy serving him in spite of the trials. And then in chapter 3, verse 2, we're constantly in need of bridling the tongue. We all stumble, he says, in many ways. If one does not stumble in what he says, he's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. You know, trials cause, in some people, impatience. These people are being greatly tried, and some have become impatient. And what does impatience lead to? You know what it does. It leads to frustration. You become frustrated. And people begin to launch out sometimes at one another, looking for someone to blame. And sometimes even brethren start quarreling with one another and complaining against one another. And that's exactly what's going on here, because in the midst of his instruction to be patient in chapter 5, he'll say in verse 9, and don't complain against one another, brethren. Stop your complaining. Stop quarreling. You read chapter 4, you talk about quarreling. These people were at one another because they were frustrated. There were trials, and the trials, they would continue for several more years, actually, for several more years. And so this instruction is greatly needed for them, is greatly needed for us. The farmer doesn't sit around doing nothing while he waits for that harvest. He's busy weeding, he's cultivating, he's repairing equipment, he's building up the barn, the storage unit, and he's helping his neighbor. He's helping his neighbor with his cultivation and maybe his storage unit, whatever the need may be, repairing his equipment, because he knows his neighbor is going through the same situation he is. He's not quarreling with his neighbor. He's helping his neighbor. And so patience means to abide under stress, even great stress if need be. Patience means we stay put, spiritually speaking. We stand fast. Though at times we feel like running away, we stand fast. Patience is passive in waiting on the Lord, his answer, his way, his time. Patience is active in that we continue to grow and serve the Lord in whatever way we can, whatever way we know is right. Just as Mary, we do what we can. Now, looking back at James chapter 5, he gives 3 examples of patience. The first example of patience is, again, verse 7, the example of the farmer. A farmer is very, very patient. My dad was a farmer. And so I can tell you it requires a great deal of patience. Dad was eager to get that seed in the ground. but southeast Missouri, similar to what you have here. You had to wait for the soil to thaw out, and you had to wait for it to dry because of the cold and because of the snow. So you had to be patient waiting for all that to happen. Even then, you couldn't plant the seed. You had to plow the ground. You had to break it up so that the ground is in a consistency that's conducive to planting the seed, so that it's ready to receive the seed. And so finally, you're able to plant the seed. And then what? Well, you just hope you get an early rain so that it'll germinate and begin to grow. And then what? Well, then you have to cultivate. Then you have to weed it. Those cursed weeds come up, gypsum and bull nettle, cockleburr, and lamb's quarters, and all these wonderful weeds. You know, you've got to trim them out of there, dig them out of there, maybe 2 or 3 times. And then you hope for more rain. And then finally it's time to harvest. And that harvest is not easy. When it comes to cotton, that's what he grew. But it takes a great deal of patience in order to be a farmer. Now, why would he go through all that? Why would he, put up with so much work? And why would he undergo all of that waiting? And the answer is there in verse 7, because he hopes for the precious produce of the soil. The harvest is worth the work. The harvest is worth waiting for. And so it is spiritually, James says. Don't grow weary, Paul will say later. James is saying that here. Don't grow weary in well-doing. When the season and the opportunity is there from the Lord, the reaping will come. And you know the reaping is worth the wait, is worth the work. The reaping is far greater than any effort you and I will ever put forth. It's far greater. The reward far outweighs the work that we may put forth. There are seasons of the soul as well as seasons of the soil. God works in the soil of our heart, breaking the soil of our heart, planting the seed, cultivating that seed, and then in the end, there will be reaping. Wait upon the Lord. Stand fast. The second example given by James here in chapter 5 is that of the prophets. He said, you know about the prophets. In verse 10, as an example of suffering and patience, he says, consider the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count them blessed who endured. These Jewish Christians would greatly appreciate this illustration because they knew the prophets. They knew about Micaiah, who'd been thrown into prison by Ahab because he preached the truth. They knew about Daniel, thrown into a den of lions, Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego, who were thrown into the fiery furnace. They knew about Jeremiah, who'd been thrown into an empty pit, left to die, called a traitor by his own brethren. And of course, they knew about Moses, who endured terrible hardships from his own people. Hebrews 11, we just read this in our Sunday evening class, Hebrews 11, beginning at verse 35. Read this summary with me here in Hebrews 11, beginning at verse 35, please. He says, some were tortured, not accepting their release in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. This is verse 36. Others experienced mockings, scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn in two. Tradition says Isaiah, the prophet, was cut in half. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world's not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves, holes in the ground. What trials you've been facing lately? Now, why would God's prophets endure such terrible things, even death? The answer is in verse 16 of Hebrews 11. As it is, they desire a better country. that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And he's prepared a city for you and I. Jesus said, blessed are you when men revile you, persecute you, and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad. Great is your reward in heaven. So they persecuted the prophets who were before you. That's noble company. Noble company, company of the prophets. And you can join that company if we endure with them. The third illustration given by James in chapter 5 is that of Job. We can readily identify and remember some of the experiences of Job. Let's just read a few of them. In Job chapter 1, go back with me there, please. Job 1. In Job chapter 1, God allows Satan to afflict Job. Verse 12, he says, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. And so Satan is given carte blanche to afflict Job with one exception, that is his person, his body. And so, verse 13, it happened on the day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. A messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, donkeys feeding beside them. The Sabaeans attacked and took them. They slew the servants with the edge of the sword. Those servants would be like children to a man like Job. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Verse 16, while he's still speaking, here comes another wave of tragedy. He said, the fire of God fell down from heaven and burned the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. Verse 17, while he's still speaking, he came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, made a raid on the camels, slew the servants. I alone have escaped to tell you. And then the worst news of all, verse 18, he said, your sons and your daughters, Job, they were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. A great wind came from across the wilderness, struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell on those young people and they died. All of them. I alone have escaped to tell you. Now that's a powerful strategy by Satan. And keep in mind, Satan's behind this. It is tragedy without explanation. It is suffering without an answer. It is injustice at its worst. And if Job can overcome and stand fast and abide under those kind of trials without giving in, there can only be 2 explanations for that. Only 2. Number 1, he must truly love the Lord his God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his strength, and all his body. And circumstances, though they're terrible, did not override his love for God. God could actually trust Job to worship him even though his circumstances were so bad. I wonder if God can trust us to continue to worship him and serve him though our circumstances may get far worse than what they are. And the other reason is actually more important than the first reason. Is God worthy of that worship just because of who he is? God. Is he worthy? Regardless of what's happening to me. And the answer in the book of Job is yes. Job worshiped the Lord in spite of his circumstances because God is worthy of such worship. And those answers, I believe, are forever given to us in the book of Job. What is his answer? What is his response? In verse 23, Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head. He fell to the ground and he worshiped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And through all of this, he did not sin nor blame God. So the hedges are taken down, the fences are removed. And yet, instead of bitter cursing and finger pointing, there's praise and worship. Praise and worship. Remember Job. Remember the prophets, the farmer. The harvest is worth it. It's worth all the waiting. It's worth all the work, whatever it may be. You may have heard these words at some time, but may not realize that these words that I'm about to read to you were found in a journal. They were written down in a journal by a Civil War soldier. This is what he said. I asked God for strength that I might achieve, and I was made weak, that I might learn to humbly obey. I asked God for health that I may do greater things. I was given infirmity that I might do better things. I asked God for riches that I may be happy. I was given poverty that I might be wise. I asked for power that I might have the praise of men. I was given weakness that I might feel the need of God. I asked for all things that I might enjoy life. I was given life that I might enjoy all things. I got nothing that I asked for, but everything I hoped for. I am among men most richly blessed. You may remember Churchill in October of 1941. He was asked by his alma mater, Harrow School in Harrow, England, to return and give a speech. And he agreed. He would go and he would give that speech. It was in the midst of great turmoil. England was already in the war. And Churchill had, with all of his might, urged Roosevelt to enter into the war. But as yet, Roosevelt said, no, we're not going to enter into that war. Of course, that would all change in 2 months. But in the midst of this turmoil, he said, yes, I'll come and I'll give a speech. And so he came to the school, Harrow, in Harrow, England, and, here are all these students eager to hear what Churchill has to say, pen in hand, ready to write it down. And so here's the speech he gave, in essence. And I quote, never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never. In nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in, except to conviction of honor and good sense. Never give in. Now, if such a man can say things about secular life, surely Christians should be able to say the same about an eternal home in heaven. Great is the reward that's awaiting us. Do not grow weary in well-doing. The reward is there, but we'll reap only if we faint not. Never give in. God's patience is great. He's so patient, so merciful. But his patience eventually runs out, even for us. And if we're harboring some sin, living in sin, we need to put that away, because he is patient, but his patience will run out. Don't think the patience of God is eternal. It's not. It will run out. If you need to come to the Lord, take advantage of his mercy, his grace right now. It is great. Whatever your sin is, his grace and his mercy are greater. He's ready to receive you. And so let's take advantage of this wonderful patience he's given you for another day to make your soul right with the Lord. Will you come as our brother leads us in the song, please? Let's stand.